Senators Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren want President Biden to forgive $50,000 of student loan debt per borrower. Now, they claim that he can do this unilaterally through executive order. However, President Biden has said he would support a $10,000 student loan forgiveness plan, and he wants Congress to pass legislation in order to implement it. The COVID-19 relief plan, the $1.9 trillion relief plan, currently does not have any student loan forgiveness proposals inside of that plan. In fact, if any legislation were to occur, it's unlikely to happen before the end of summer because there's currently a pause on student loan payments and interest until September 30th of 2021. So the big question is student loan forgiveness going to happen, and can President Biden legally implement an executive order in order to make that happen? Here's what you need to know. Hey guys, it's Justine with the College Investor, investing and personal finance for millennials. And if you have federal student loan debt, this is probably on the top of your news feed and you're wanting to find out whether or not this student loan forgiveness is actually going to happen. So the question is, can the president cancel all federal student loan debt? Now, President Biden alone does not have the authority to do so. Congress has to authorize it. So when Congress passes legislation, they give the power to Biden to implement an executive order in order to carry out that student loan forgiveness. Where the waters get muddy with this is through the Higher Education Act of 1965. In this particular section, it can be misinterpreted. Let's go into the text and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so under this section of the Higher Education Act of 1965, it says here that the U.S. Secretary of Education can enforce, pay, compromise, waive, or release any right, title, claim, lien, or demand, however acquired, including any equity or any right of redemption. But we're only looking at one subsection of another subsection. So if you go up here, it's in the context of, in the performance of and with respect to the functions, powers, and duties vested in him by this part, the Secretary may. In other words, when Congress authorizes a loan forgiveness program, such as the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which is in fact intact today, then the U.S. Secretary of Education has the authority to carry out that forgiveness program under those terms. Now, without that, President Biden does not have the authority to go ahead and make that decision on student loan forgiveness alone. Now, in a different text, under the Federal Claims Collection Standards and the Standards for the Compromise of Claims, it says here that agencies may compromise a debt if the government cannot collect the full amount because of 4 reasons. The debtor is unable to pay the full amount in a reasonable time. The government is unable to collect the debt in full within a reasonable amount of time. The cost of collecting the debt does not justify the enforced collection of the full amount, or there is significant doubt concerning the government's ability to prove its case in court. So these 4 reasons really prevent President Biden from forgiving student loan debt from borrowers who are able to pay back that debt within a reasonable amount of time. So you might be asking yourself, what about the payment pause and interest waiver? So while President Trump was able to authorize those waivers, you might be wondering, doesn't that set a precedent to leverage student loan forgiveness? However, under the HEROES Act of 2003, those interest waivers and payment pauses were able to be implemented because it ties back to the national state of emergency. However, forgiving student loans goes beyond the scope of what's necessary to ensure that borrowers are in the same position financially before the national emergency and after the national emergency. The next question you might have on student loan forgiveness is whether the amount forgiven should be taxed or is it waived. Now, there's actually a couple different scenarios already in place on student loan forgiveness and how those amounts are taxed. So tax-free student loan forgiveness is already in place for those working in a particular occupation, death and disability discharges, or any employer-paid student loan repayment assistance programs. Now, currently, student loan forgiveness is taxed on any remaining debt that is on an income-driven repayment plan after 20 or 25 years. In that scenario, the leftover debt would be taxed. The IRS can forgive tax debt of student loan borrowers if the borrowers are insolvent, meaning they cannot repay the debts that they owe. So you could consider that these borrowers are insolvent due to the economic distress of the pandemic. Now, President Biden can ask IRS to forgive that taxable amount, but again, it has to go through Congress in order to authorize and specify and implement that type of action. The next question that we should ask is whether or not student loan forgiveness qualifies as disaster relief payment. Now, there's really only two situations that qualify as disaster relief payment, and that is the amounts paid to or for the benefit of an individual to reimburse or pay reasonable and necessary personal, family, living, or funeral expenses incurred as a result of a qualified disaster, or if such amount is paid by a federal, state, or local government or agency or instrumentality thereof in connection with a qualified disaster in order to promote the general welfare. But student loans aren't an expense incurred because of the pandemic, and student loan forgiveness is unrelated to the pandemic. So President Biden alone cannot forgive student loan debt. Congress really has to authorize executive action in order to make that happen. Now, we may not see any changes until the end of summer or when those student loan payments are unfrozen at the end of September. Now, if you want more information on student loan debt forgiveness and what's happening with federal student loans, be sure to check out all of our latest news and information at thecollegeinvestor.com.